So we're waiting on the ranking member. He'll be right here. He's got to gavel in on the secretary before he comes. So give us a few minutes to get him here. The Subcommittee on Europe will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the foreign policy implications of emerging threats to security and stability of outer space. I now recognize myself for an opening statement, but before I do, I ask unanimous consent that the member from Florida, Representative Herodopoulos, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Just a few weeks ago, the world watched as our astronauts completed a historic mission circling the moon, the first astronauts to return in over half a century. It was once again a powerful reminder that American leadership in space is unmatched and must remain that way. However, the realities in outer space are very much different today than they were 50 years ago. Space is now a congested and contested domain, one the U.S. Space Force characterizes as a warfighting domain. Our hearing today on space security is important as our subcommittee grapples with the question of how to compete effectively and maintain U.S. leadership in a competitive global environment where technology and the nature of conflict are ever changing. Space is an environment where actions can be difficult to attribute, formal norms are limited, and intentions are frequently unclear. China, for example, has engaged in aggressive maneuvers in space, from pushing defunct satellites out of orbit to close proximity operations that the U.S. Space Force has characterized as dogfighting in orbit. It is difficult to distinguish between benign and malign actions in space because so many space systems are dual use, frankly. Put simply, a satellite's grappling arm that may be used to repair another satellite in peacetime could, in wartime, be employed to disable a U.S. reconnaissance or military communications satellite. The competition is not only playing out in orbit, but also here on Earth. China is rapidly expanding space partnerships in developing countries, investing in ground infrastructure to improve tracking, monitoring, and launch capabilities. And while China has now surpassed Russia as America's greatest challenger in space, Russia still maintains a formidable space program. For years, the Russians have been deploying a nuclear-capable anti-satellite weapon that, if employed, would have devastating impacts on satellite operations in low Earth orbit. At the same time, concerns in outer space extend well beyond counter-space capabilities. The competition for space superiority is also front and center in the civil, commercial, and diplomatic realms. Programs like NASA's Artemis Accords, in coordination with the U.S. State Department, show how American leadership in space strengthens our alliances and advances U.S. interests. 63 countries have signed on, establishing a shared framework to guide the civil exploration and use of outer space. But China is working aggressively to challenge that leadership, from lunar base ambitions to expanding satellite constellations through the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. That is why it is encouraging to see the State Department prioritizing these emerging challenges. Secretary Rubio created a new Bureau of Emerging Threats, which, among other priorities, will focus on the very space security issues we are discussing today. It is important that we authorize this Bureau and advance additional legislative actions, which we will discuss in more detail today, to ensure this committee supports efforts to strengthen the security and stability of the space domain. As chairman of the subcommittee with oversight responsibility of the Bureau of Emerging Threats, as well as a member of the Space Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Technology. I look forward to working with my colleagues to advance these priorities. I would like to thank all the witnesses for your time today, and I look forward to hearing your testimonies on this important topic. The chair now recognizes the ranking member from Massachusetts, Representative Keating, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing here today. For decades, the United States has engaged in strategic competition in space. This began with a space race in the Cold War and continues today as we race back on our way to the moon. Yet the race to achieve new heights in space continues. The U.S., China, and Russia are increasingly competing in space in the military and security sectors. As our world becomes more interconnected, the need for greater number of satellites has driven the development of new space-based capabilities, as well as the systems to counter them. Today, the threats posed by space-based security issues have been longstanding, and in recent years, the United States and international organizations have taken important steps to mitigate risks and ensure the freedom of movement in space, while also recognizing that space is a militarized domain as well. In 2019, NATO allies declared space an operational domain, and at the end of the 2021 Brussels summit, NATO recognized that attacks on, from, or within space present a clear challenge to the alliance. Meanwhile, in 2022, the Biden administration implemented a moratorium on direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing, or ASAT missile testing. The moratorium on ASAT testing, as well as efforts like the Artemis Accords, demonstrate not just how the United States will position itself to compete in space, but also how the United States will lead in space. We've established norms, promoted responsible behavior, and worked with allies and partners to create a shared understanding of how we should engage our adversaries in space. Space, by definition, requires a coordinated strategy to ensure the United States can not only participate in the system, but also shape it. I'm disappointed in the Trump administration's space policy and certain steps that have taken by the administration that have hurt U.S. interest. First, the administration has failed to publicly reaffirm the prior administration's moratorium on direct ascent asset testing. These weapons should not be tested, and a failure to reaffirm this policy gives way to countries like Russia and China to test offensive capabilities as well. Second, the Trump administration needs to provide more information to the public about its plans for Golden Dome. While Golden Dome has increased security in concept, the administration has not provided enough details to Congress or the public about how it plans to utilize the requested $180 billion for this program. At the same time, many critics believe such a multi-layered missile defense system will be prohibitively expensive and impractical. Others believe the administration will use the contracting process for Golden Dome to reward its friends at the expense of the American taxpayer. We need answers, and I hope the administration can provide them to us, and importantly, to the public. Finally, the Trump administration must do away with its quote-unquote American alone policies in space and double down on international engagement. This includes the International Telecommunications Union election later this year, where the administration must work to re-elect Doreen Bogdan-Martin as Secretary General. It also means working to protect the U.S. delegation and the U.S. industry, as well as they travel to China for the World Radio Communications Conference in 2027. After the Trump administration's chaotic start rewarding China with the hosting of this conference, we must now ensure that China's home field advantage in Shanghai doesn't stack the deck against U.S. interests. Space is and will remain a national security interest for the United States. As ranking member, I believe the State Department must play a more robust role in carrying out our space diplomacy efforts in combating China and Russia's influence in space. Moving forward, U.S. leadership in the space arena relies on upholding the vital frameworks and initiatives it's already put in place long before the administration, but with an administration that has the opportunity to carry forward still. I'm hopeful our panel here today can shed some light on these issues, and particularly how we in Congress can further our space diplomacy efforts in the Department of State and throughout all the U.S. government. I look forward to questioning the witnesses, and I yield back.
Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. The Honorable Kari Bingen, the Director of the Aerospace Security Project and Senior Fellow of the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Scott Pace, the Director of the Space Policy Institute at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And the Honorable Mallory Stewart, the Chief Executive Officer at the Council on Strategic Risks. This committee recognizes the importance of the issues before us and is grateful to have our panel here to speak with us today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Ms. Bingen for an opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today with these esteemed colleagues and friends. I was privileged to work with this committee while staff were on the House Armed Services Committee and saw firsthand the importance of your work. I would like to highlight 3 key challenges shaping the space security landscape and offer 5 recommendations on how we better employ the diplomatic tool of national power to address them. First, space capabilities underpin how our military fights and projects power, providing connectivity across dispersed forces, intelligence in denied areas, and are critical to missile warning, precision targeting, battle damage assessment, and weather. In Ukraine, we have seen how a militarily overmatched nation can use space-based assets to level the playing field. Starlink became a lifeline for connectivity, and satellite imagery is aiding in battle space awareness and helping to document evidence of war crimes. It should come as no surprise that our adversaries want to deny this battlefield advantage. China and Russia possess a range of counter-space weapons. In the last year alone, we have seen prolific jamming of GPS and communication signals. Chinese and Russian satellites are conducting unusual and concerning maneuvers in orbit, including a first-ever orbital refueling mission in GEO. These dynamics are a key reason the Space Force and Space Command were created. They are focusing on building more resilient space architectures, developing operational tactics and procedures, and integrating with allies and industrial partners. A second trend is the rise of commercial space. More than 80% of satellites on orbit are commercial, and over 100 countries now operate in space. With more actors in space, broader access to technology, and greater economic stakes, global competition is intensifying. China, for example, is building its version of Starlink and Falcon 9 rockets and challenging the long-standing U.S. lead in commercial satellite imagery. One consequence of this new dynamic is a far more transparent battlefield. Persistent surveillance from worldwide remote sensing satellites means that military movements and signatures are increasingly visible. This is playing out in real time in the Middle East, where U.S. firms have withheld satellite imagery to protect U.S. forces in the region and avoid aiding adversaries, while foreign providers, including Chinese companies, continue to supply similar data. We need a more nuanced policy approach that protects national security without disadvantaging U.S. companies relative to foreign competitors. At the same time, U.S. forces must adapt to a more transparent battlefield by strengthening operational security, training under persistent surveillance, and investing in protection, deception, and disruption capabilities. Third, China is the most consequential threat and competitor in space. Marking one of the swiftest climbs in the history of any modern space program, China has amassed hundreds of satellites in orbit, set record launch rates, built satellite gigafactories, and advanced flagship projects related to space station and the moon. China is using space as a tool of diplomacy and influence, expanding its partnerships across the global south. On the diplomatic front, Chinese delegates are becoming increasingly skilled at navigating international forums like the ITU and the UN. The long-term implications are profound. As nations align with either the US or Chinese in standards, the winner will not just supply technology. It will set the terms by which information flows, networks interoperate, and how the world is seen. So, recommendations. First, space is soft power. US space companies remain global leaders in SATCOM and Earth observation, navigation, and launch services. For many partners in the global South countries, US firms provide practical solutions. Satellite imagery for agriculture monitoring, maritime surveillance to combat illegal fishing, communications that connect underserved regions, and geospatial data that supports disaster response and infrastructure development. The State Department should expand this advantage. Our embassies should actively support the U.S. commercial space industry, and space data and services should be integrated into their security cooperation toolkit. This is a threefer: strengthening U.S. industry and increasing investment in U.S. companies, extending American influence, and countering China. However, outdated export restrictions still treat many space technologies and data services as though they were weapons. So second, we must continue to modernize our export control policies and processes, finding a better balance between protecting sensitive technologies while enabling firms to compete and partner globally. Third, our allies and partners from Europe to Japan are committing to record defense budgets, including major increases in space. The State Department, working with their defense and commerce colleagues, can shape these investments so they produce capabilities that complement ours, create opportunities for U.S. industry, and strengthen collective security. Fourth, the United States should sustain leadership in key governance and standard forums like the ITU to support U.S. companies in managing scarce spectrum, shaping technology standards, and best practices for satellite operations. Finally, we are in a strategic technology competition with China, which has prioritized aerospace alongside AI, quantum, and biotech. These technologies will reshape warfare and confer significant economic and geopolitical advantage. We need a holistic approach that advances U.S. technology leadership while checking China's progress. This will require deepening states' technical expertise and better integrating it with diplomatic tools. So I'm hopeful that the new Bureau of Emerging Threats can provide such focus. The United States leads in space today, but that lead is not assured. Sustaining our strategic advantage in space will require urgent action at home, strong partnerships abroad, and continued leadership in shaping the future of the domain. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Pace for an opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for holding this important hearing, and thank you also for the panel you've assembled here with some honored colleagues that I've worked with for many years. In light of ongoing military operations, disruptive technologies, and shifting balances of power, this is a very timely opportunity to consider American space enterprise, and in particular, the role of diplomacy at the U.S. State Department. We have moved from a bipolar contest between the United States and the Soviet Union into a crowded field defined by globalization, democratization, rise of new space. The United States Space Forces envisions its future operating environment as being what they call a heteropolar world order, a global system defined by uneven concentrations of capability where the United States and China hold dominant but asymmetric influence. Our most visible space effort, the Artemis program, is not a military effort, but it is a geopolitical instrument of national security and diplomacy. It signals that the United States intends to lead an international and commercial coalition built on transparency, shared expectations, and a sustainable presence. For the State Department to meet the demands of this new strategic landscape in space, I offer a few recommendations. First, of course, strengthen the T and E family coordination. The recent reorganization that merged arms control and nonproliferation into a Bureau of Arms Control and Nonproliferation, I believe, is the logical one. Disarmament and nonproliferation are two sides of the same coin, so aligning these functions within the department to act more efficiently to address threats from weapons of mass destruction, including those that may use the space domain. This should not neglect the civil side of space, as represented by the Office of Space Affairs in the E family, and the role played by multilateral institutions, such as the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Civil, security, economic interests are all important to U.S. foreign policy. As was mentioned, a focus on the ITU in the upcoming World Radio Conference 2027 is crucial. The department must take an assertive lead on ITU matters, not leave it to others, speaking with a unified voice for the administration to balance the equities of both government and the private sector. The work team needs to be fully resourced and engage early with regional blocs, such as in the Americas, Asia Pacific, and of course Europe, to enter into Work 27 with a coalition that can defend a rules-based spectrum governance. Next, complete space export control reforms. As was mentioned, the State Department should finalize the space export control reform regulations that were released for public comment in late 2024. We need to ensure industry feedback is incorporated, and it's crucial that foreign commercial availability is evaluated on the front end of the process, so U.S. firms are not restricted from selling technology that is in fact already accessible on the global market. Third, strengthen allied space security dialogues. The U.S. should move beyond episodic consultations to include space security in annualized dialogues with priority allies, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Japan, Australia, India, and South Korea. These dialogues should explicitly integrate space into broader defense and deterrence conversations, aligning threat perceptions, and pre-negotiating crisis response procedures. Next, expand a space-literate diplomatic cadre. I'm in international affairs school, so teaching more space to international affairs majors is a pet project. The department should develop and maintain a cadre of space-literate diplomats who can serve as resident experts in key embassies and multilateral missions. This expertise can draw upon other agencies like NASA and the Department of War, who have representatives at U.S. embassies, but we need a whole-of-government representation at our embassies, one team, one fight, to ensure our commercial and space security interests are embedded in our diplomatic engagements in a more integrated way. In conclusion, space activities touch all aspects of our national life. The rules of this new frontier will be made by those who show up, not those who stay behind. If the United States and its partners lead, we can ensure the space environment remains safe, stable, and conducive to our values of liberty, democracy, rule of law, and free market principles. And that should be a guiding goal of U.S. space diplomacy. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Stewart for an opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members. Good morning, Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My fellow panelists have already underscored the importance of outer space to the United States as well as the growing threats to our space systems. I will reemphasize one specific theme. If the United States does not lead in shaping the rules of behavior in outer space, others will. To elaborate, I will briefly address 3 points. First, why the U.S. must work with its allies and partners, both for greater outer space security and in the formulation of rules. Second, why the U.S. needs clear space security policy leadership from the State Department. And third, how the State Department's bilateral and multilateral engagements advance U.S. national security interests. As this subcommittee knows well, one of America's greatest advantages is our alliances and partnerships. These relationships are not just political, they are operational. They are built on shared laws and norms that allow us to cooperate with predictability, interoperability, and trust. The same logic applies in outer space. For decades, the United States has understood that it is in our national interest, as well as the global interest, to establish rules for greater outer space stability. We have done this through treaties, norms, and shared practices. As space becomes more congested and contested, however, the risks of miscalculation and conflict will grow. The limited existing rules will not be able to support the scale and scope of operational growth. Moreover, as discussed, space is extremely relevant to global militaries. That makes it even more important to strengthen deterrence and resilience against attack in outer space. Alliances and partnerships are central to this effort. Interoperability among allied systems increases resilience and allows us to respond collectively if systems are disrupted. Collaboration enables us to establish shared expectations for responsible behavior in space. Establishing such expectations in the form of rules helps us deter and identify anomalous or intentionally irresponsible behaviors, giving us more time to protect and defend our collective assets. For the strongest possible partnerships, trust is critical. Without it, cooperation declines and normative deterrence is not possible. To sustain our partners' trust, the United States must demonstrate that its approach serves collective and not just national interests. This is where U.S. diplomacy plays a central role. Russia and China have promoted a narrative that the United States seeks to dominate space, and they have proposed to legally ban all space-based weapons. Putting aside that their proposed treaty fails to address their own ground-based cyber and dual-use capabilities, the text itself lacks a clear definition of a space weapon. Because any satellite in space could be used as a weapon, such a legal prohibition would be meaningless, unenforceable, and would not improve space security. The United States has taken a different approach to space rules, focusing on observable, verifiable behaviors. A clear example is the 2022 initiative to ban direct descent debris-generating anti-satellite tests. Despite Russian opposition, this effort gained the global support of 155 nations in the United Nations. That success was not automatic. It required sustained, coordinated diplomacy to demonstrate that the initiative benefited all nations. This is what space policy leadership should look like: support for practical, verifiable rules that enhance our collective security and outer space stability. But effective U.S. diplomacy abroad depends on close coordination at home. Today, responsibility for space security is spread across multiple U.S. agencies and within multiple State Department bureaus. That structure can work, but only with strong leadership. With the cancellation of the U.S. Space Council, the State Department must play a stronger coordinating role, aligning the interagency and commercial sectors, engaging allies, and ensuring that the United States government speaks with one clear voice on all space security issues. Finally, the State Department should restart and expand U.S. space security dialogues. These dialogues allow us to share threat perceptions, explain our policies, and better understand those of other space actors. They also help coordinate the U.S. interagency, bringing together the numerous voices in space security diplomacy to ensure a unified message. These engagements, especially with our strategic competitors, are stabilizing. They reduce misunderstanding, build transparency, explain U.S. positions, and help prevent escalation. In sum, the future of space will not be shaped by emerging technology alone. It will be shaped by rules, norms, and leadership. To protect U.S. interests in outer space, we must lead in collectively defining clear, enforceable rules of responsible behavior, strengthen alliances and partnerships, improve policy coordination across the government, and reinvigorate the State Department's space security diplomacy. If we fail to do so, others will shape the environment in ways that could undermine our security. But if we lead clearly and consistently, we can ensure that space remains stable, secure, and accessible for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I will start by saying I believe that we are currently in a hybrid war with China today and other nations, but certainly with China. So a lot of our discussion so far has been about rules, and we need rules, but we also have, I think we need to understand that we are already in hybrid war. So Ms. Bingen, in your written testimony, you talked about ensuring we have adequate defenses and necessary offensive capabilities. I don't hear people talk a lot about offensive capabilities in cyber and space. Can you talk about what offensive and defensive capabilities we're currently investing in? Are there other things that we need to be in, specifically the offense I'd like for you to focus on?
Chairman, I would be happy to. And if I can first frame it by, I mentioned there are a range of threats that we see China and Russia pursuing, from cyber methods to electronic warfare like jamming, all the way up to kinetic activity, direct descent missiles, on-orbital systems, and then even nuclear. So that all speaks to us looking at investing in defensive capabilities and more resilient architectures. At the same point in time, when you see what China is doing in space, building and launching over 500 ISR satellites today, building their versions of Starlink, they're essentially closing their kill chains. And frankly, they're practicing targeting our ports, our ships at sea, our bases. When you think of an Indo-Pacific scenario, so much of our military connectivity, our command and control, our ISR, our eyes, our ears, our ability to communicate rests in space. The Chinese know that. They're also taking advantage of space to target our forces on the ground. It raises the question of we also need capability to hold at risk their ability to see us, to target our forces on the ground. It doesn't have to, there are options. You can do it kinetically, you can do it non-kinetically. But we are now at a time where space is being used against our joint force, and we need to have tools in the toolkit to hold that at risk the same way that they hold our systems at risk.
Thank you. Dr. Pace, Ms. Bingen again, you also said delivering capabilities that would support our allies' security needs. What do you think that looks like? Is that like our FMS program for weapons systems? Are we talking about money? Are we talking about equipment? What are we talking about there when you delivering capabilities to our allies?
It's a range of options. It's everything from our industry building satellites and providing them as part of a sovereign architecture for Japan or for.
But
for-
how do we do that? I've got that. How do we do that? Is this an FMS system, a DCS system?
I think it can be all of the above. I think it can be direct commercial sales. It can be through FMS and security cooperation. It can be providing hardware. It can be providing
have that
software.
today?
We're providing services.
Do we have that today?
To some degree, we do, and I mentioned a bit briefly, sir. There are some of our export constraints, ITAR in particular, is inhibiting certain sales and provision of data, but it is allowing for others. So it is a mixed scorecard.
Which brings me to one of the points you made. We need more nuanced policies in your spoken testimony. What are those nuanced policies? You're talking about ITAR,
That's one of the
export control.
That's one of them, and I would not recognize. I mean, this committee's done a tremendous amount of work in this area. One example, though, that I'll give, and this comes from my time working in the commercial space sector at a company commercializing signals collection, and I will acknowledge I am currently on their advisory board. But they were providing data on Chinese fishing vessels to allow our partners to counter illegal fishing. That data, that dot on a map of those fishing vessels, are still subject to ITAR.
Okay, very good. And Dr. Pace, obviously China is hosting the next radio communication conference in Shanghai. What policies do we need to see come out of that, and how do we keep China from using their home field advantage, I think one of you said? How do we do that? Because they do have a home field advantage.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things. First of all, strategically, that one of the most important things we can do is to strongly support Doreen Bogdan-Martin's reelection. We nominated, of course, during the first Trump administration, renominated for her current position during the Biden administration. We nominated her again. She's been a tremendous asset, and in terms of ensuring that the ITU is run in a fair way, I think her reelection is number one. Second thing we need to think about at a fairly granular level, security for our delegation while they're over there. World radio conferences always have a certain share of intelligence activities going on from various countries. The fact that this is where it's located in China is a particular problem. There'll be people who won't be able to actually even go there. So paying attention and to the resources and practices to secure our own delegation in that area.
Thank you, Dr. Pace. My time is up, unfortunately. I appreciate it. I wish I had more time, but I'm going to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stewart, in your remarks, you emphasized the need for partnerships and cooperation. Can you take a few minutes and detail the progress that's been taking place going forward and the importance of getting these partnerships to share norms, to make sure that the principles in the international community are aligned, and particularly in the area of space, and how that's different than so many other approaches that we have to take?
Thank you for the question. Really appreciate the
Oh,
emphasis.
I'm sorry, could you move the microphone closer to you?
Yep. Really appreciate, Thank you for the question and appreciate the focus on partnerships, alliances, and norms, especially in the outer space arena. The previous administration, and in fact, administrations prior to the Biden administration, had focused on developing processes and standards that could enable greater cooperation that were in the interest of stability and security of the outer space arena, because we recognize that that was also in the U.S.'s interest when operating in the space environment. In order to achieve these norms and these treaties, we had to work collectively with the global community to explain why it was in all of our interests to have some standard rules, to have some norms that allowed us to know which way we were going in situations in which we were going to have conjunctions, in situations in which we may interact, to allow us to understand what is normal and responsible behavior, so that anything that fell short of that could be identified as irresponsible. That system that really we developed in numerous domains like aviation and maritime allowed for safe operations, and allowed us to understand how we should perform even when intentions are unclear. In the space domain, when intentions are even less clear, because we cannot communicate directly, we cannot see very clearly where these satellites are operating or what their intent is, we need those norms and cooperation capabilities more than ever. And so the US has pursued the direct descent destructive ASAT testing normative principle in the UN. The US has pursued another strengthening of the Outer Space Treaty in 2024 in the UN First Committee resolution, recognizing that treaty and emphasizing Article 4's prohibition on the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit around the Earth, particularly to highlight for the international community that any activity to violate that Outer Space Treaty would be harmful to all space operators. And in fact, the US believes that the Russians are developing such a program to place a nuclear weapon in orbit around the Earth. And so highlighting this treaty, highlighting this norm of responsible behavior is important to our success. The reason we need partnerships is so that they can agree and support and collaborate and in fact enforce the normative deterrence against those irresponsible behaviors. And this has been the approach of many US governments up until this point, and hopefully it will continue in this administration.
Yeah, you mentioned the direct descent ASAT testing. With the conference coming up and everything else, what's the opportunity for this administration and other administrations going forward to have that kind of clarity and the importance of that going forward? How should we approach the Chinese and the Russians about this? I'll open that to anyone in the panel that might want to comment on that, the importance of that.
I'm happy to answer that question. I agree that the US government should reaffirm its commitment not to conduct direct descent destructive ASAT tests. The US has made this operational decision years ago. This is not any problem for us to recommit to, but it's important for us to affirm this normative approach so that the rest of the world sees that we are being responsible players, and to highlight that if anyone violates this normative approach, it's irresponsible and it degrades the environment in the outer space arena for long-term sustainability, is not in the interest of the global community, and should be deterred by preventing contracts or continued coordination with any country that conducts such a direct ascent destructive ASAT test.
Yeah. There's about 25 seconds left. So.
I would say that one of the important things about this is to recognize that a lot of developing countries are recognizing that they're incredibly reliant on space. So we want our space systems to work. They want the space systems to work because they're reliant on it. And by providing an attractive narrative where people can join with us, responding to U.S. proposals, those votes come our way, and those votes are important in the ITU, they're important in COPUS, they're important in shaping that sort of global environment. And so people need something to vote for, not just to reject, these rather unworkable Chinese and Russian systems. So whatever gives us something that others can rally around is very helpful, because the interests of the developing countries, I would argue, are in many cases aligned with what our interests are. We want space to be stable and peaceful, and leave it alone.
Thank you, and I think you hit the central point. I think we'll hear more of in this hearing, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize the representative from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for this hearing. For our witnesses, thanks for your preparation and your comments already today. As we talk about the emerging threats, space is one of those areas where there's emerging opportunity, but there's inherently emerging threats. It's also often observed that the chief export for the European Union is regulation. So one of the primary threats to anything is too much regulation or bad regulation. So maybe start with you, Mr. Pace. What concerns should the United States have about the EU's proposed Space Act?
Thank you for that question. I think it's interesting that both the Commerce Department and State Department work fairly closely to provide U.S. comments back to the EU. And it's also fair to say we have a number of problems with that. The EU desire to regulate and, in many cases, put up barriers to U.S. firms being able to operate inside the EU is a serious one. In many cases, if you look at the language, it looks like it could be okay, but on the other hand, it could be interpreted so many different directions. And so because of that vagueness, because of that uncertainty, I think there are a number of problems with it. One of the ones that of particularly keen interest to me are some of the requirements on cybersecurity. Some of the EU requirements there are fairly onerous, fairly expensive, and I suspect would probably hurt European firms as much, if not more, than ourselves. So Europe is playing its hand, I think, in regulation, but it's not really a good one. I wish they were doing more in other areas to be good partners with us, including in defense and burden sharing, as well as working with us in multilateral forums, as was described.
Yeah, I think they're pretty already well-staffed on regulation. So they haven't staffed up on space and defense. Do they have an autonomous space capability, or to what extent do they depend on the United States?
They do. They do have a lot of capable technology, and therefore it's disappointing they don't do some more with it. They're deeply concerned about the state of commercial industry because they see that as a source of innovation and power part of the United States, and they're concerned with how do they keep up with it. But they're not really doing the kind of reforms I personally would argue for in terms of slimming their own regulation, putting more private equity and financing into their markets, and putting on a more entrepreneurial end. There are things they could do, they recognize they can do. It's been hard for them to bring themselves to just pull the trigger and do what they need to do to compete.
Yeah, so as we look at our relationship with historic allies in Europe, are we at least united in the threat and challenge posed by China and Russia?
I believe there's a common sense. I'll defer maybe to my colleagues here, but there is a recognition of the threat. There is a lot of good discussion at the working and operational levels, I think, within NATO and within the military. The problems tend to be, I think, at the higher sort of political and economic competition levels, which are not always as aligned as we would like them to be.
Yeah, thanks. Ms. Bingen, you have thoughts on, are we united in countering China and Russia?
So sir, I think in general, I would agree with what Dr. Pace said. A lot of it, though, comes down country to country. So NATO increasingly has recognized space as a warfighting domain, and we have threats, particularly the Russian threat. Germany and France are increasing their space budgets, including for defense and security. ESA, the European Space Agency, civilian agency, but for the first time has been given a mandate to also support security. If I can also touch on your first question briefly and generally talk regulation, we have such an innovative commercial space sector right now. Private capital is going into these areas. There are missions now being commercialized that I would have never imagined being commercialized. It was something only the government do or we imagined only the government would do. So the challenge here is we do not want to stifle this innovative sector where we're still exploring these new missions and applications before they even get out of the gate.
Yeah, thanks. And so for taxpayers back home, they often think of space as, why would we weaponize space? People don't always think about all the commercial applications that are there for communications, not just for defense, not just for targeting or surveillance, but even GPS and our way to, operate in modern society. So space is an increasingly important domain. And so I get the frustration with Europe, I guess. I'd say, why should we keep working with these folks? I mean, there's a sense of frustration at some point where you go, well, look, you guys just do you, we're going to do us. It's a shame to get to that point on some levels of this, but what are the pros and cons of that? Just saying, look, we're done trying to persuade you. We're just going to do it, kind of go it alone, as it's alleged. Dr. Pace?
I would say that that would be very unfortunate if it came out that way, because first of all, a practical reality among the, as you're familiar with, the Five Eyes countries of Canada, UK, Australia, they're integrated in our operations. I mean, we sit console by console, with these folks. We're looking at Germany is starting to make movements toward a more serious defense posture. They're putting more funding into space-related areas. We'll see if they can execute on that. So as Kari Bingen was saying, you have to look country by country, and in that regard, the EU itself is somewhat disappointing, but individual countries are making movements. You're seeing movement in the commercial sector by Italy. You're seeing France taking some of the commercial stuff more seriously. We'll see what they can do with it. As I mentioned, the Five Eyes are aligned with us. So I think if we look, as the phrase is, a more nuanced approach, there are some signs of hope that we should encourage and work with, while still pushing back against the attempts to have a giant top-down European regulator in charge.
Thank you all. I appreciate your testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you. We are already 16 minutes into a vote, so this committee will recess for votes, and we will return.
Thank you for your patience. The committee comes to order, and I now recognize Representative Amo for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Earlier this month, the Artemis II mission reminded the world what's possible when we lead and when we lead together. This wasn't just an American achievement, as you know. It included partners in Canada, one brave astronaut, Jeremy Hansen, and it was built on decades of cooperation from partners around the world. This isn't the first time we coordinated with our allies to make space exploration possible. The world watched Neil Armstrong take a giant leap for mankind, thanks to scientists in Australia relaying the broadcast from space around the world. In 1975, the US and Soviet Union met in space for the first time as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And since 2000, the International Space Station has served as a microgravity laboratory, bringing together astronauts from 26 different nations to conduct groundbreaking research. We don't lead in space alone. We lead by bringing others with us. We lead by setting the rules, shaping the standards, and ensuring that space remains peaceful, stable, and accessible. That's why I'm working with Congressman French Hill to pass the Taiwan and American Space Assistant Act, also known as the TASA Act. Our bill would help NASA, NOAA, and the State Department coordinate more effectively with Taiwan on space exploration, satellite programs, atmospheric research, and, importantly, science education. It's also why efforts like the Artemis Accords are so important. They bring countries together around shared principles and avoiding a destabilizing race in orbit. And just last week, Jordan became the 63rd signatory of the Accords, and we hope to welcome additional countries to the Accords as the Artemis program continues. So I'd like to start with Ms. Stewart. How does the international cooperation in space, like the Artemis Accords, benefit the United States?
Thank you so much for that question. Absolutely agree that the Artemis Accords benefits the United States because it brings everyone together on the shared principles of supporting the Outer Space Treaty, of sustainability and safety. It coordinates our efforts toward a common goal of cooperation, of understanding where we're coming from and where we want to achieve greater scientific progress, civilian benefits across the board for all participants. The outline of the expanded Artemis Accords provides some principles to ensure future space exploration is peaceful, sustainable, and beneficial to all. And that's certainly in the U.S. national interest. We need to keep our reliance on outer space safe and secure. We need to be able to grow and expand into the space commercial industry, and we need to work with partners and allies for resilience, for interoperability, for greater capacity in the scientific arena. So this is all consistent with the principles of the Artemis Accords, and it's consistent with the U.S.'s own national practices, even if the Artemis Accords didn't exist, is that our ability to cooperate with others expands our capacity to utilize, to benefit collectively from the outer space environment, and to work collaboratively. And so having these kind of concepts of Artemis Accords, of other normative agreement with partners and allies, allows us to work together toward mutual benefit. And that is really important in the outer space arena.
And I appreciate that sentiment. It highlights the fact that our security, our self-interest is deeply connected to partnership, right? We have to move together. Now, under President Biden, the State Department dedicated a special envoy for space who worked to advance American leadership in space exploration and to foster commercial opportunities. But unfortunately, President Trump eliminated both the Office of Science and Technology Cooperation and the Science Envoy program, weakening our ability to lead and coordinate globally. So again, Ms. Stewart, what were the benefits of having a special envoy for space? What opportunities is the United States missing out on now that that role was eliminated by the Trump administration?
Any opportunity to coordinate the complex issues in the outer space environment, the complex sort of reliance we have from commercial to science to military and other reliance purposes is important. And to have one special representative who could help as an envoy bring all of that together, understand it more clearly, and even be a figure for the international community to reach out to if they had questions, if they wanted to understand better or cooperate with us. That was valuable, and that was seen as beneficial to the U.S. national interests. In the absence of a special envoy, we need to understand who are the touch points, who can provide the communication, coordinate everyone, and be available to other governments and other partners in the commercial arena to help guide those conversations toward cooperation. I think, you know, in the absence of the U.S. Science Envoy program at the State Department, specifically having that science envoy for space, we should figure out how we enable that coordination, the cooperation, and the voice that can represent the U.S. government.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I appreciate you highlighting that space personnel yields good space policy, and we have to continue working together with that. I yield back.
Good. I now recognize myself. Ms. Stewart, at the State Department, civil and commercial space diplomacy are handled under the E family, while space security, arms control, and defense-related space issues are handled by the T family bureaus. This organizational split reflects the dual-use nature of space, but can create disconnects in policy execution. So from your experience at the department, can you briefly discuss how, or characterize the day-to-day coordination and information sharing between the bureaus? And if you can talk about what improvements you can suggest for robust inter-bureau coordination to avoid sending mixed signals to allies and partners. But let me throw one more question out there. In practice, how do the relevant bureaus ensure alignment and coherence when the U.S. engages in international forums such as Conference on Disarmament, which is led by ACN, and the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that is led by OES?
Thank you so much for the question. I had the benefit of working at the State Department under the existence of a Space Council, which actually one of my colleagues on this panel was an excellent leader of. That Space Council helped us coordinate our international messages, helped us coordinate our commercial capacities, helped us sort of think more inclusively as to what we needed to address and how we needed to address across the spectrum of arenas we were appearing in for outer space policy. So that was very valuable. In the absence of a Space Council, the U.S. State Department does try to coordinate its messaging when there's overlap. And the important part about that is that between the bureaus, we should make sure there's invited participation in all of the external representation. So having the E family on T family appearances, having the T family help advise and participate in E family conversations, making sure that externally we have a coordinated message requires everyone who's dealing with space to work together, because sometimes the overlaps are not as obvious. But having presence on the delegation, I think, is the really important part.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pace and Ms. Bingen, China has made itself the default partner for developing nations seeking space capabilities, and through integrated packages to support developing space programs, including satellites, launch, and ground infrastructure, Beijing has expanded its footprint across the global south in ways that often embed Chinese technology standards and potential dual-use dependencies. So what should the U.S. do to compete more effectively and ensure we are the partner of choice for countries looking to develop a space program? And how can we leverage U.S. advantages in innovation, transparency, and alliance networks while addressing the cost and financing barriers that currently favor China? Dr. Pace, you want to go?
Thank you for that question. Yes, China is making a lot of advances across the global south. The famous Belt and Road Initiative, and there's a spatial component of that. I think one of the first things I would recommend is the greater use of the Development Finance Corporation in the U.S. We have capabilities at DFC, XM Bank, and so forth that have not really been specifically space-focused. And some of the kinds of investments that developing countries need are quite a bit less than ports and harbors and other kinds of things that DFC is used to. So I think that's an underutilized capability that could be leveraged even further if it's coordinated with overseas support, say with countries like Japan and Korea that do international aid, but we could coordinate more coherently across the Asia-Pacific region. And then lastly, I'll say that the Artemis program itself, we have a number of signatories that are fairly small, and the question is, well, what are they going to do? This is where I think NASA, in talking about increasing the number of robotic missions to the moon, there's an opportunity to provide more payload opportunities for those countries to contribute small payloads that they can't afford, to then help us increase the cadence of activities on the moon, and that countries that are even fairly modest can be a part of this effort. So I think that will also help in outreach by giving an alternative to the China narrative that otherwise would be out there.
Thank you. Ms. Bingen, can you add to that?
Yeah, Congressman, absolutely. What I see is China is using these space as a tool of diplomacy and influence. So they're expanding their presence, their ground infrastructure across Latin America, across Africa. We see countless examples of that, and some colleagues at CSIS have done a fantastic job through a program called the Hidden Reach series. For us, space is tremendous soft power. We have this phenomenal industrial base that still leads in many areas of technology. We have this burgeoning startup ecosystem. It is soft power. And so from state's perspective, I look at there really be 3 authorities and 3 areas that it can very much press on to leverage that soft power of space. So commercial direct sales, our embassies, our folks on the ground encouraging U.S. space solutions, working with our industry. Number 2, we talked a little earlier about FMS and FMS. It's traditionally been focused on ships and aircraft, but I think there's a space component to that we need to look at and think creatively about. And then third, security cooperation. Our security cooperation officers in these embassies is to look at those authorities and what space data and services could be brought to bear for maritime domain awareness, resource management, et cetera.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Representative Titus for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that Chairman's gone because I wanted to direct some of this to him, but thank you for sitting in for him. I'm really still trying to understand why we're talking about space today when there are so many other issues in the subcommittee's jurisdiction that we could be talking about that are happening like on Earth. We've got the war in Ukraine that continues to rage. We've got democracy that's backsliding in Europe. You've got energy insecurity that remains top of mind for our European allies and partners. You got USAID's dissolution, which spurs worldwide health crises. You've got rising authoritarian influence throughout Eurasia, and that doesn't even take into account Trump's war of choice against Iran, which is having an impact on Europe, raising gas prices, fertilizer prices, and we've even seen the Iranian drone attack on Cyprus, which is a critical partner of ours in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, I'm wondering if perhaps we're having this hearing to distract from the administration's failure to meaningfully address any of those major issues here on Earth. I don't mean to imply that space doesn't matter. It certainly does. Mr. Keating laid out lots of reasons why, and our witnesses have talked about that. But, you know, if the majority were serious about space security, as the chairman alleges, they might start by supporting the very institutions that makes American leadership in space possible. Oh, they're doing just the opposite, as it turns out. The Trump administration has proposed cutting NASA's budget by roughly 23%. That's about $5.6 billion. They're slashing the science programs by nearly half, effectively eliminating dozens of missions. They've removed every member of the board overseeing the National Science Foundation just a few days ago. But here we are holding hearings about space security and yet at the same time undermining the very infrastructure that underpins our competitiveness in this field. And that doesn't even take into account STEM education. That's the pipeline for the next generation of scientists and engineers who will be the tip of the spear when it comes to implementing some of the policies that y'all have recommended and addressing some of the threats in space. But the administration has proposed eliminating NASA's Office of STEM Engagement, just getting rid of it altogether, which cuts programs that support students around the country. And at the same time, thousands of research grants have already been canceled or frozen across federal science agencies, disrupting billions of dollars in innovation. All of this is happening while we're sitting here talking about how we need to be superior in space. So what is the goal here? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a commitment to space security and a commitment to talking about space while you're dismantling the very capabilities that make space leadership possible is just counterproductive. Now, if we're serious about competition with our adversaries, we'd be serious about investing in technological leadership, serious about national security ties and where those investments can be made. So whether it's on Earth or in orbit, maybe we should go back to funding some of the science that would make this superiority possible. And we should address the urgent geopolitical challenges that are right here on Earth in front of us before we start speculating about what's going to happen in space. Now, we also hear that the White House is planning to cut NASA's Science Mission Directorate by half in fiscal year 2027. Scientific research missions rely on government funding to survive. Without that funding, the programs focused on innovative research and exploration are just going to disappear. Ms. Stewart, how do you justify cutting funding, and how is that going to undermine our stated priority of ensuring American space superiority?
Thank you, Representative Titus. I agree that we need to support our outer space infrastructure domestically in the science and technology arena, including in the NASA budget context. I don't disagree with what you've said. I think the good news is that there's a lot of agreement on this panel, and it sounds like there's a lot of agreement in this subcommittee of the importance of outer space for our alliance building and our partnerships, and hopefully for the future of our safety and security. So while these cuts are happening and these concerns are valid, I'm hoping that this committee, this subcommittee, and this panel can help encourage greater coordination and cooperation for the future of alliance building, but also for the future sustainability of the outer space environment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Moylan of Guam for 5 minutes of your questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the panel. For Guam, we're really concerned about the Indo-PACOM situation, of course, and our aggressor being the most western soil of the United States, so close to our aggressor in China. I think any support that we can get from, with your efforts here would truly help out Americans in Guam and protect our allies as well. But one thing we also realize as Guam continues to have increase in military readiness in the buildup, especially, military readiness also depends on a resilient local community. Now, if Guam's civilian power grid, communication lines, ports, and hospitals are targeted as a precursor to a space domain conflict, it directly impacts the Space Force personnel and mission. So, Director Bingen, do you believe that the federal government is providing enough dual-use investment in Guam's infrastructure to ensure our space assets remain operational during a regional crisis? And what investments should we be making into our dual-use infrastructure on Guam to harden them against cyber attacks and other threats?
Congressman, thanks for that question. I've been fortunate to visit Guam when I was here as a staffer on House Armed Services Committee. It's beautiful, beautiful place, incredibly important to our security. You know, I would say a few things is one, space capabilities have a role in the defense of Guam, period. When I think about, you mentioned, for example, undersea cables and staying connected to the rest of the world and to our, distributed forces across the Indo-Pacific. Space capabilities provide that communications, that command and control, that connectivity. Our missile warning capabilities are key, and there are our key missile defense systems on Guam. Our ability to see threats coming, have that indications and warning to buy our operators and our policymakers some time and space to be able to posture, that all relies on space-based ISR. And then in areas like maritime domain awareness, is having awareness of what's going on, the Chinese fishing fleet, the gray hull vessels, et cetera, that relies on space. So incredibly important. To your point, I mean, we've seen the Chinese pursue cyber methods to penetrate critical infrastructure on Guam. The Chinese are also building an array of space-based ISR, or intelligence gathering satellites. They're pairing them with their communication networks so that they can have this high ground to see targets, bases, ports, including in Guam. That is deeply concerning. So, I think one of the key areas for us is putting greater investment in defending our capabilities and providing more resiliency for Guam. But then also, and I mentioned this earlier, sir, is we do not want China to have that unblinking eye over Guam or anywhere else in the Indo-Pacific where our forces are. And so that's going to require us taking some different and new measures to protect our forces and our facilities on the ground.
I thank you, and thank you to the panel. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I now recognize Representative Costa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I want to associate, first of all, my comments with Representative from Nevada. I think this is an important issue, and my questions will, I think, seek out to underline that. But the issue in Iran and the issue with Ukraine, I think, are also important issues, and we ought to be discussing those as well. All three of you agree that Russia and China are adversaries. And you talked about us taking the leadership while we still can to set up the goals and the rules. Is that correct? See your head nodding there. How do you believe that the United States is going to be able to do that in the development of counter-space weapons then with the threat posed by Russia and China? Who would like to respond?
Well, thank you for the question, sir. I think we are capable of creating the counter-space capabilities necessary to hold Russian and Chinese assets at risk, and that hard power is absolutely crucial to ensuring stability and deterrence. But I think that that can't be separate from our diplomatic activities of getting other countries to align with us and find their common interest with us. As I mentioned earlier, many developing countries are very much opposed to conflict in space because they understand their infrastructure would be placed at risk.
And I think our allies,
Absolutely.
that include NATO and other allies in Asia, would be willing to do so too, if we weren't spending so much time belittling their capabilities and their partnership. So why would Russia and China be willing to engage, assuming that we could put together a coalition of the willing to discuss counter-space weapons?
I think there are several ways to try to encourage Russia and China to engage with us on the challenges of counter-space weapons, and that's encourage the international community to accept certain parameters as in all of our interest, including the creation of debris. And so we can start with the prohibition on intentional debris creation, ASAT testing.
What scares you the most? You can each respond by this being unattended with Russia and China.
Sorry, what scares me the most on what?
If we leave this under the current status quo.
I think the arms racing in outer space will continue unabated with no guardrails, and we'll see the diminishment of the sustainability of the arena through creation of debris, potentially through the placement of a nuclear weapon on orbit or other violations of the Outer Space Treaty.
Kari, what scares you the most?
I think at the ultimate end, it's a threat like Russia's nuclear anti-satellite capability that, if deployed, could lay waste to entire swaths of orbits in space that we use not just for security, but for civilian science, for commerce.
Well, we haven't even begun to talk about the potential in North Korea, an outlier, to capably have the ability to create havoc.
And I think that's a really good point, is it doesn't necessarily take an orbiting space mine with a nuclear weapon to cause significant damage. It could be somebody with a missile program and a nuclear weapons program that pair the two.
And so what would be the goals and that you think, if we were to bring together such a dialogue, as you referenced it, that we should be aspiring to? What goals? Yes, Mallory Stewart, you have your hand up.
I think we can clearly remind the international community of the importance of the treaty and normative architectures and show that we should work to strengthen those. And one of the ways is to work on verification technologies. At the Council on Strategic Risk, we're working to develop awareness of existing technologies that can verify the Outer Space Treaty's prohibition on the placement of a nuclear weapon in orbit. And that's really important for the international community to work on. The outer space community was negotiated in the 60s, and we didn't realize how much technology could actually help strengthen that.
Is there concurrence among the two of you with Stewart's comments? Would you add or subtract?
Well, sir, I think that I agree with the comments that my colleagues have made. I would just simply stress that in the meantime, we need to be looking at working with our allies on exercise.
I couldn't agree with you more. By the way, my time's expired, but Dr. Pace, we can agree to disagree, but until Congress changes the name of the Department of Defense, it's defense. And it may please some in some sectors to hear Department of something else. Congress ultimately has the authority what all these departments and agencies are named, and we have not changed that. Thank you.
I now recognize the representative from Florida, Mr. Herodopoulos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to wave on today. As many might know, I chair the Subcommittee on Space, and I really appreciate your thoughtful comments today. I'm learning every day. I want to focus in on our relationship with the PRC and understand where we're at. It's pretty exciting to see that what a lot of people thought was science fiction just maybe a generation ago is becoming a reality in a positive way. But we're also concerned about some of the things that the Chinese are doing in space. As you know, it's so important for our power grid, communications, GPS, you name it. And we see some nefarious things the Chinese candidly are doing in space. And so the question I have for you is, where are we cooperating with the Chinese? Where can we improve that without risking our national security? So Director Bingen, if you wouldn't mind answering that question, and I'd like to move on to Dr. Pace as well.
So let me first say, sir, I think China is the most consequential threat and competitor to us in space. At the same point in time, you go back to the Cold War, we still figure out a way to talk to the Soviets, to reduce risks, to reduce miscalculation. I think there's a near-term opportunity here for us to engage in some sort of dialogue with China, and I'd say it should be focused around space safety. China is in the process of putting up several versions of their Starlinks, thousands of satellites. The way that if there's just to put it in real terms, if there is a risk today of a collision course between a Chinese satellite and a US satellite, the approach we take today is an email, and we hope that the Chinese answer it. That's not a good strategy, and it puts all the accountability and the actions on US operators. They now have much more skin in the game. We need to figure out a way to talk with them on just reducing the risk of collisions. I think that's a good way to start. But I'd also say we don't just talk for talking's sake. They have to meaningfully come to the table.
Dr. Pace, if you could add to that, please.
Thank you. There is a number of areas, I think, following on that comment about exchanging information. To put it in really basic terms, we need basically direct machine-to-machine discussions between SpaceX, Starlinks, Amazon Leo, OneWeb, and the Chinese counterparts. We don't have that yet, variety of political barriers to it, but the actual operators need that kind of direct information because doing an email and hoping for an answer is just simply too slow. So we need to find a way to get to that kind of exchange. We have some cooperation with China now to deconflict around Mars. We deconflict around space stations. We don't really deconflict around the moon yet. That is an area of increasing activity we're going to need to talk about. I think that there are a number of areas where we can do science cooperation with China, biomedical experiments, sample exchanges, and so forth. Having said that, I will also say that I'm still a supporter of the Wolf Amendment. I think that it's perfectly reasonable to ask that we clear who we're working with on the Chinese side, that there be something of mutual interest. I understand some people don't like it because it's a symbolic sort of statement. On the other hand, I don't think it's a fundamental barrier to doing things that are clearly in our mutual interests. So while sticking with that and recognizing others can disagree, I think there are a number of things that we can still do, as we did with the Soviets, but recognize who we're dealing with.
Ms. Stewart, if you would comment as well.
absolutely agree that there are numerous areas we could actually coordinate or at least communicate with China regarding outer space stability and security. I think China equally relies on the lower Earth orbit and would be challenged by intentional creation of debris in the same way that our assets are challenged. And I think we've seen their evolution of anti-satellite testing go from a 2007 test that created 4,000 pieces of debris to a subsequent test of what we expect was a similar system not creating any debris. So they've evolved to understand that intentional creation of debris is a challenge. And I think if we could coordinate or communicate the threat perceptions we see in the outer space arena in a way that doesn't disadvantage us, in a way that doesn't advantage them, but in a way that equally recognizes our mutual reliance on that arena, we could work together to hopefully prevent Russia's program to place a nuclear weapon in outer space and to work to eliminate or at least diminish the intentional creation of debris.
Thank you. And on the last question for Director Bingen is that, do we have any confidence in the Chinese, given some of the things they're already trying to do in space, where they've shown, there are any goodwill gestures they're making at this point other than rhetoric?
Well, I think the recent era where the Chinese communication to NASA saying they were going to maneuver one of their satellites and told us, you guys don't move, or move around you, that was certainly a good first step. A fundamental problem I think that we have with China is that they want to have a political agreement first before they'll engage in some of these lower level norm setting. And I think we'd like to build confidence from bottom up, norms and exchanges before getting to some sort of larger agreement. I think the reality of the Chinese large constellations and their own self-interest are going to, I think, hopefully drive them toward a more practical discussion. But as long as they hold out a requirement that we sign up for some unenforceable arms control agreement, I don't think we're really going to get very far. So the sooner that we can get to reality, I think, with them, the better.
Thank you, Dr. Basin. Mr. Chairman, thanks again for the opportunity to serve today.
I now recognize the representative from Florida, Mr. Fine.
Well, thank you. And thank you all of you for being here today. Look, the United States has always been the leader in space, and I'm incredibly grateful to the President for reinvigorating it. I used to represent Kennedy Space Center when I served in the legislature. One of the few exciting things when you're in the legislature, you get invited to just about every launch that exists. And I was privileged to see both America's returned to manned spaceflight, Artemis 1 and Artemis 2. It is part of what makes America, America. It's what makes our kids inspired to be involved in science and math. But as we've also seen now, it is not just about the science. It is also a potential weapon that could be used by our adversaries around the world. I am very concerned about China, as I know many people are. I think China sees itself at war with us. I think we don't oftentimes look at it the same way. And so my question, and I'll open it to any of you who want to take a shot at it. China's building terrestrial space infrastructure around the world, but most prominently in Africa and here in the Western Hemisphere. Many of these systems could be described as dual use. How could a commercial or scientific ground station also support military or intelligence activities? I'll open that to whichever one of you would like to answer.
Congressman, you're exactly right. In some of the research that we've done at CSIS, we have seen China develop agreements with a whole host of different nations across the global south and in Latin America as well as in Africa. And they are putting space ground infrastructure, antennas, ground station, command and control sites. It's basic technology, software and hardware that allows those ground stations and those antennas to communicate with a government system or a commercial system. But here's the catch to the point you were making, sir, is in China is even though they're starting to build out a commercial space sector, it's still very heavily driven by the PLA and the state, financing, policy, even the priorities for what that commercial sector does. So it is hard for me to, at this point in time, sit here and say, this is purely just commercial and dual.
So your statement is basically there really is no difference between commercial and military space in China today.
It is hard to make that distinction. If I can add one more thing, sir,
Yeah.
is we're seeing not just them build out infrastructure, put many more satellites into orbit, but we're also seeing them build out their own space industrial base. You know, we sit here, we talk about the imbalance in shipbuilding or drones. I think people would be surprised to hear how much they are building up their industrial capacity to go big in space.
So-
Satellite gigafactories, aerospace cities, et cetera.
So what risks, and you can continue to answer, what risks do these ground stations located in the Western Hemisphere pose to U.S. national security? And are there things that our State Department can use in diplomacy to reveal the risks of hosting terrestrial space infrastructure owned by China to our allies and partners? Dr. Pace, go ahead.
I would say one of the first things is to work with those countries to have them get greater transparency on what's happening on their own territory.
So they may not know.
I think in many cases they don't know, or they simply assumed what they were initially told. And the ability for us to maybe make clear that they haven't been fully informed as to what's happening in their own territory would be a place to start.
I would just add to that that in some of these countries, they don't even have access to these facilities, that they've been built by the Chinese. They were told that they would have access and learn from it to their advantage, these local.
And then they don't.
Exactly. And
They
so-
don't keep their word, huh?
Exactly. And
All right.
raising that point
Shocker.
with them and highlighting that this is a challenge for their own participation in the arms race that's happening in outer space, and they could be implicated by supporting China's
All right,
development.
so I only have 1 minute left, so let me ask this question then, and we'll start with you, Mrs. Stewart. What actions can Congress take? What could we do to discourage nations in our hemisphere from hosting these dual use, which may not be dual use, terrestrial space infrastructure? What can we do about it?
I think there's several things that could be done. I think raising the awareness in these countries is something the State Department should be required to do through its conversations of space security dialogues, whether these dialogues are part of new conversations or part of 2+2 or military analysis conversations, but raising awareness in those countries of the need for them to understand exactly what's happening on their territory is something Congress can ask the State Department to focus on.
Dr. Pace?
I would also say this is where we can look at, as I mentioned earlier, Development Finance Corporation and others, so that the Chinese aren't the only ones out there offering, potential terms and conditions for their own developments. I think the commercial space industry in the United States, supported by the U.S. government as part of the foreign policy interest of the United States, can make headway in a lot of those countries who are interested in being part of a growing commercial space industry worldwide. It's attractive, and they want to be a part of it.
And I wish I had time, but I'm out of time, so maybe someone else will ask. But thank you all for being here and addressing this real issue that faces the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I'm going to start a second round if anyone wants to stay for a second round. I want to talk about what you were just discussing, freedom versus a command economy. We saw this under the Soviet Union. Back in the Cold War, we thought the Russians were 7 feet tall, and in fact, I commanded a tactical nuclear weapon in a Special Forces detachment. We carried a little man-portable nuke. Our sole mission was to go deep to stop operational maneuver groups coming out of deep Russia because we thought that they could overwhelm NATO. I think we're in the same situation because we figured out the Soviet Union was a command economy, and eventually that falls. So we're in the same situation. Now, I want to read just from several sources here about the Trump administration perspective on space. First of all, from the EO, superiority in space is a measure of national vision and willpower, and the technologies Americans develop to achieve it contribute substantially to the nation's strength, security, and prosperity. The United States must therefore pursue a space policy that will extend the reach of human discovery, secure the nation's vital economic and security interests, unleash commercial development, and lay the foundation for a new space age. That's in the EO. Then we have to understand that for the United States Space Force, we're investing more than $75 billion. It nearly doubles the budget for the U.S. Space Force. And lastly, under this subcommittee, we have the Bureau of Emerging Threats, and frankly, they are charged to safeguard our national security against cyber attacks, the weaponization of space, and similar malicious efforts. So to say that the Trump administration is ignoring space and space security is a misstatement. And I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record these articles on the Trump administration's efforts to ensure space superiority. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank our panel of witnesses. This has been, I hope I didn't miss a whole lot, but I really appreciate your testimony. And I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.